lot of people got it wrong in the first years of the war, that Russian economy would collapse. And now I think the pendulum swung the other way. You could ask, is Putin running out of money? Well, he's already run out of money.
It is now almost like a bubble of the war economy. So the only sectors that they have recovered to the pre-crisis levels and actually have grown some are the sectors related to the war economy.
Is there an argument that Putin needs the war to go on because of the way that the Russian economy has now been orientated? Hello and welcome to the Fourcast. For months after Putin's invasion of Ukraine, Western leaders said Russia was on the brink of collapse under sanctions. And yet it didn't. It transformed into a wartime economy fueled by military production, redirected trade routes and deeper ties with China and India. But now there are signs this may be changing, with industrial output slowing, inflation rising and severe labour shortages as hundreds of thousands of working-age men have either died, emigrated or been mobilised. And Western leaders are once again questioning how long Putin can bankroll his war machine. So is Russia's economy finally starting to buckle, or is this still wishful thinking from Ukraine's allies? With me today, Arkady Ostrovsky, Russia editor at The Economist, and Elina Ribakova, one of the world's leading experts on sanctions and Russian macroeconomics. Let's begin with the simple question, if you like, of whether Putin really wants a deal right now. Arkady, is he under economic pressure that is pushing him towards wanting an end?
I don't think he wants to suddenly leave Ukraine alone. I don't think he suddenly wants to stop his bigger offensive against Europe and against transatlantic security system, which he is set to, he wants to undermine. So I don't think we should look at the deal sort of separately. Now, is he under pressure? Yes, he is under some pressure. Does that mean that the war is going to end? That doesn't necessarily follow.
Elina, what would you say?
Well, I would say indeed, I fully agree with Arkady that we need to separate the two. And I think that's where the biggest mistake we in Europe and in the West make vis-a-vis Russia. They have separated the two at the very beginning of the 2022 invasion. They went into this head-on, understanding what kind of sanctions can be implemented. There were some surprises, but not many. They prepared for the sanctions since 2014, and they were willing to take the cost. However, what they didn't plan for the fact that it would take so long, and it is indeed incredible that size matters, economy, number of people, but yet Ukraine still holds 4 years on, right? Russia wasn't entirely prepared for that. They were hoping for either blitzkrieg of maybe 2 days or maybe a couple of years. And now we're in the situation where instead of producing more tanks got more expensive. And therefore, we've seen the central bank of Russia trying to slow down the economy. And that is also affecting the production of the military industrial complex.
Right. So to what extent is Russia's economy dependent on the war? And to what extent is the war dependent on the economy?
I think it goes both ways, indeed, right? It is now almost like a bubble of the war economy. So the only sectors that they have recovered to the pre-crisis levels and actually have grown some are the sectors related to the war economy. They have slowed down recently, but not really fully to negative territory. Most of other sectors have not recovered their losses. So it is almost like pricking the bubble, right? We talked a lot about it before the global financial crisis, that it is very hard to do politically and economically. At the same time, it is also giving opportunities for people that have not had a social lift in decades. Weaker regions, they're getting contractual payments for participation in the war, or regions where there is military production. So this is on the one hand. On the other hand, of course, for Russia to be able to continue at this pace is challenging. And that's why they're looking for new sources of investment. And that's why they're trying to negotiate, whether with the US or with countries in Asia, for some sort of blink for less forceful enforcement of sanctions.
Arkady, do you think the West misunderstood this at the beginning?
I think the West did misunderstand it. I think the West misunderstood a lot of things, and I think the West continues to make a lot of mistakes towards Russia. We can talk about it in terms of public opinion and the links between public opinion, economy, and politics of it. But in terms of economy, yes, as you said rightly, everybody was expecting Russia to collapse. It did not, but the pressures are catching on. The divide between the civil economy and the military economy part of the economy is growing. Now, the source of income for Russia is shrinking, which is why Russia has the biggest budget deficit I think it's had in modern history, and very high inflation, and 40% of Russian budget goes towards the military, towards the war, both in terms of production of weapons and in payments of contracts and the death payouts. So I think the pressures are building up. I think the West misunderstood it at the time when they expected it to collapse. I think it's misunderstanding what game Putin is playing now, and actually how complicated that relationship between the economy, the society, and the politics really is.
Yes, I mean, I think at the beginning there was this assumption or a lot of commentary that this would not be sustainable for long, that the impact of the war would be felt by ordinary Russians, and that this would dramatically affect the popularity of Putin. Why hasn't that happened?
He made it a commercial war. It's the most extraordinary things. People don't talk about war, partly because of that, and partly, to a great degree, is because of repression. I mean, Russia is a highly repressive, almost totalitarian regime where speaking out will land you in jail. So you have a certain living standard which is maintained across the population. You have the army, which is, most people think, okay, well, they're getting paid, so we don't need to feel sorry for them. And you have a repressive system, which basically punishes speaking out against the war, and it creates a false idea of homogenous support. And that is, I think, the biggest mistake the West has made in recent months, is basically completely accepting and embracing Putin's propaganda that all Russians support the war, or the majority of Russians support the war. And the picture is much more nuanced, but the Western policy towards Russia and the Western rhetoric towards Russia has reinforced Putin's propaganda rather than confronted it.
Right, but I mean, accepting the fact that he's commercialized the war and that people are not being dragged off against their will, the numbers surely at this point are so enormous that everybody must be touched by it.
You're right. I mean, the numbers are huge. I mean, Russia's losses in dead and wounded, some say, it's a million, around a million, which is enormous. And yes, it is contractual, and I wouldn't say it's all, there is a lot of deception, there is a lot of pressure. To what extent it's voluntary, it's another matter. I don't think it is, a lot of it is not voluntary. A lot of it is actually people who are drafted into the army by law and then pressured to sign contracts. So there is lots of deception. But yes, you're right. Ultimately, everybody now knows that the losses are huge, and people see it in their cities and towns and the villages, because the size of cemeteries is growing, and everybody, particularly in a small place where people have been taken from. Mostly, it's not large cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's disadvantaged, economically poorer regions of Russia. Of course, people see it. It is having an impact. If you ask people what they would like, they say they want the stop of the war. They don't want mobilization. They do not want to participate in it. And they want 60% want improvement in the relationship with the West. Interestingly, the argument you hear a lot is that, well, none of it matters because public opinion in Russia doesn't matter because people don't have any agency. But actually it does, not in the direct way that everybody expects, that people will just come out in the streets and overthrow Putin. People can't do that if there are tanks and people with guns. But in terms of the why the Kremlin cares about public opinion, and it does, it measures it all the time, is that it creates a milieu in which it can operate. It needs to have this picture. Putin, from the very beginning, from the moment he came to power, he came up with this idea of supermajority of people supporting him. That is the source of legitimacy.
Let's turn to the economy. To what extent did sanctions backfire? And how much was Russia able to turn itself towards China, towards India, and adapt?
Well, I think first we need to think about objectives of sanctions. Sanctions do not create world peace. They don't change regimes. They don't resolve your educational reform at home, right? I think we just loaded too many things on this magic tool that is supposed to be like a magic wand, and then Putin disappears and we'll live happily ever after. So I think first we needed to have realistic expectations. In terms of realistic expectations, should we give foreign exchange to Russia in exchange for their oil? Probably not. Should we sell them missile and components of missiles? Probably not, right? This is the extent of sanctions that I would like to see, with clear targets and clear measurable objectives to check against them, right? So this is first. Whether Russians get luxury goods or not, frankly, I don't really care, right? And most people in Ukraine that getting the shahids to their house also don't really care. So this is the first part. In terms of what backfired, I think what backfired is our poor enforcement and implementation of sanctions. We gave the huge window for China to drive through with a truck, and more than 90% of various sanctions evasion schemes happen via China. It may be Western produced or Western owned goods that ship through China, or maybe are produced in joint ventures in China or licensing and then go to Russia. Of course, other border states are also at fault. And I think that has created a special relationship, and is also allowing China to test drive sanctions evasion techniques against possible sanctions that they might experience in the future.
So are you saying that pretty much everything gets through anyway?
Not everything gets through. Things spend longer time traveling to Russia. They're more expensive, but a lot of things still get through. And we can see that from the disassembled components, parts that the Ukrainian authorities are disassembling and putting online. You can see that Russia still has access to Western components, albeit more expensively and with the longer production times.
What about the US administration's approach to trying to tackle this? I mean, they've been terribly fierce on India, but not terribly fierce towards China.
Well, there is this panda in the room that they're very afraid of addressing, right? And I think it is also characteristic to this administration as well as the previous one. If you look at the statistics, China started supplying these components already in autumn 2022, and it's almost sort of went to the pre-war levels, the volumes, thanks to China. And we sort of closed the blind eye to that, and we tried to have behind the closed door conversations with China, and didn't quite really work out, right? So I think here, the current administration seems to be following the same strategy. Maybe they would like to have a grand deal on trade, and they do not want to have the pesky Russia-Ukraine war issue getting in the way of that. Specifically in terms of India, I would like to see more decisive action. Yes, there have been some good announcements, but let's see if there will be enforcement.
Right, but how is all this fed through to Russia's domestic economy, and to what extent is it under pressure? I mean, the question kind of feels, is there an argument that Putin needs the war to go on because of the way that the Russian economy has now been orientated?
Once you have driven into the bubble, and we all remember Greenspan that nobody likes to prick the bubble, right? It's very hard for you to stop that. And we've seen all these musical chairs, let them continue from the bankers, before the global financial crisis. And there is something very similar here, because Russia has been writing 5-year plans of diversification from commodities, of productivity growth improvements. And at some point, they just started rewriting the same plan because they struggled to find the new raison d'etre or productivity growth, apart from just being a commodity economy. And this war economy has given this temporary boost. And I think that is very hard to stop. Even as Arkady was describing, even an autocratic regime, people still worry about the opinion of the people. And specifically in autocratic regimes, the regime change is more painful than in a democratic economy.
I think that's absolutely right, what Lena is saying. And I think we should be slightly humble in that we got it wrong. I mean, a lot of people got it wrong in the first months and years of the war, that Russian economy would collapse. And now I think the pendulum swung the other way. Is everyone say, oh no, it's fine, it's so resilient, it will, nothing will actually happen, and Putin can carry on for 3, 5, 7 years. The truth is, we don't know. We haven't been to this position. I mean, Lena is absolutely right that it's very hard. Even if the war was to freeze, let's say, even if you imagine, which is very hard to imagine, some of the sanctions would get lifted, basically, I can't see any sources of growth or investment in Russia. I can't see Russian economy getting back on track. So in a way, the deterioration, the degradation of Russian economy will continue. How people will respond, how the politics will respond, we simply don't know. But we do know that in a way, you could ask, is Putin running out of money? Well, he's already run out of money. If he didn't run out of money, there wouldn't be a budget deficit, which is 5 times, I think, or Elena will correct me, larger than that what they forecast. So in that sense, he's already run out of money. And so the fact that the economy will, suffer, is already suffering, is under pressure, that doesn't necessarily, again, mean that Putin will stop. So we're in uncharted territory. We simply don't know how things are going to form, and it will be a function of many things, of where the war is going or where the economy is going, whether there are any black swans, what would, if the war was to freeze, what would happen to the soldiers who return home, what would happen to the levels of violence and aggression. There are just too many factors which we have to be, as I said, humble. And
So, Elina, to what extent is sanctions relief, needed by Russia and attractive in the peace process? How much of a priority will it be?
I think we've seen already from the person whom I call the sanctions lifting envoy, Dmitriev, that sanctions are a priority in these negotiations. Why are they priority? As Arkady exactly explained, not because it's going to boost the economy dramatically, but it's going to change things on the margin. And let's think about investors domestically, third country investors, and then Western investors. Russia doesn't necessarily hope or need the Western investors to come back. They need to have this sort of multiple equilibrium domestically to be resolved, where domestic investors with extra cash, or maybe third country investors feel, oh, wait a second, this is maybe a normalizing situation. I'm more ready to invest at these levels into Russia. And I think this is a critical moment for Russia. This signaling of normalization would give them space to invest more. And the question is whether they invest more in something productive for civilian use or something more military related. And the big risk, it will be something that is definitely military related.
Yes, and why would anybody trust that Russia won't get into further entanglements in the future when its whole foreign policy approach seems to be based on that?
Well, I can comment on the macroeconomic side of it. We have done a lot of studies at the Kiev School of Economics where we're trying to use data to track supply chains and the shipments among different parts of the Russian military industrial base. And we're seeing production of some of the type of weaponry that is not currently needed in Ukraine. So we've seen that activity, whether it's naval warfare related or maybe the airplanes. And that raises questions. What are they using that output for? What are they planning to use it for?
Arkady?
Yeah, I think there is also one very big factor in all of this, which Elina mentioned a few minutes ago, which is China. Russia would not have been able to conduct this war economically without China's lifeline. Now, China's got deep pockets. It's not going anything away for free. We know that. Chinese actually investment in Russian economy, in the private economy, is very low. But China needs Russia to be stable. The biggest mistake I think the West has made at the beginning of the war, and it was sort of almost contemptuous to think that you could isolate Russia simply by imposing Western sanctions. The world is bigger than the West. If you have India, if you have China, if you have global South, which do not isolate Russia, you cannot isolate its economy. You cannot cut the sources of revenue. The Indian companies, Chinese companies will buy Russian oil. Physically restricting Russian volumes of oil export is probably the best thing. And the best thing of all would be bringing down the oil price. And I think that is actually probably the biggest unknown factor. Is there are predictions in the market out there. Elina probably knows more, that the oil is already $50 a barrel, that it will get to $30 dollars. It will get to $30 a a barrel by the end of 2027. Now, next year is going to be the hardest year economically Russia has had. If the oil price continues to go down, that's a very different dynamic. Russian cost of extraction, from the top of my mind, I think is about $25 a barrel. So you only get $5. I mean, that you can't conduct a big war. You can't continue to pay those contracts, given that your army is contractual at $30 a barrel at the same, and keep the army of the same size. So it just becomes impractical. Putin will stop when either he is stopped or when he's unable to go any further. In terms of his intentions, the intentions are not going to change. The capacity and capability could change.
And Elina, are Russian consumers happy to be this reliant on China in the future? And I suppose in terms of labor force, the increasing number of imported workers from Africa and wherever else they may be coming.
Well, on China, I think the consumer is definitely sort of getting concerned, but it's a bit too early days. Let's look at the car imports. Russia actually imposed tariffs on its big friend China for car imports because they realized that the Western producers used to put some of the production domestically, and it led to some positive spillovers and agglomeration effects in the economy, while China was just aggressively dumping the oversupply into Russia. And that has allowed China to continue one of the biggest producers in the world in cars, because they were dumping it to Russia. So Russia actually put in a tariff on that, right? So you see already some of the concerns. But I think also the big concern or maybe embarrassment is the big flip in terms of Russia's export to China. Russia used to export to China mostly manufacturing products, more complex machinery, sometime in 2000s. Now 80% is energy and metals. So it's truly like a pump, that is sending goods to China, and it's definitely not a good look for Russian authorities or the consumer.
Okay, and what about labor, just going on into the future? I mean, if Russia has lost 250,000 dead or somewhere between that and 1 million, that's enough to have quite an effect, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, we see it already in unemployment numbers. The unemployment numbers are around 2%. This is an emerging market, right? In any emerging market, there are more frictions that would keep your natural rate of unemployment, meaning non-inflation generating rate of unemployment, somewhat elevated. This is not even a normal rate for UK or the US, right? So that's one of the reasons why the central bank was forced to hike rates. So this employment issue will be very employment or labor force issue will be pervasive. For now, it seems that the block of security block has won out, especially after the terrorist attack on I think at Crocus City Mall, where they are not letting a lot of migrant workers to come back. On top of that, you had some of the racism, nationalism issues, and also not adding to the willingness of these workers to come back. And then finally, you mentioned some of the African countries sort of coming, including from South Africa and others, being lured to Russia. And the issue is there that integration is very hard. And also many of them have to come under pretense of working. And at the end of the day, they end up either on the highly toxic, poisonous production, or some of them end up on the front line. And then, of course, they let their people home know that, well, this is not a great way to earn your money.
So finally, Arkady, I mean, it doesn't sound like you think the economy is going to force Putin into anything imminently.
I think so. I don't think there is anything to force. Unfortunately, there is anything to force Putin into any sort of a deal now. That is not to say that he doesn't have pressures. There are pressures in terms of the expenditure. There is pressures on the economy. There is a pressure. He can't. Obviously, they've been fighting for 4 years. In January, this war will be longer than the Soviet participation in the Second World War, in the Great Patriotic War. So the pressures are building up. Russia is not in a healthy position at all. But remember, it's in a war, it's always about the other side as well. It's who's got more resources. That's why the war of attrition is so dangerous. He can't deal a sort of a military final military blow to Ukraine, but if he ties Ukraine to the degree that the number of desertions is very, very high now. Russia spends 8% on the military. Ukraine spends 30% on the military. Corruption scandals, everything else. It doesn't need to be strong. It only needs to be slightly stronger than Ukraine. Talked about mistakes in the West, but the fact that 4 years into this war, European military production is nowhere near the fact that Europe still has not passed the frozen assets to Ukraine, and it's still there is more talk than action. I think that's the biggest letdown for Ukrainians, and they know this. I mean, the opinion in Ukraine is already becoming very resentful certainly of America, and now will be towards Europe, because they feel let down, because all this talk about for as long as it takes, whatever it takes, is the talk.
And finally to you, Elina, I mean, if you were an economic advisor to Putin, might you be tempted to say the lesson of the Ukraine war is that this works for Russian growth, and that Russia has shown that it can pivot to this kind of existence, and that in the medium term it suits us to keep agitating at Europe because it works for us too?
If I were a Grey Cardinal in Kremlin administration, I would definitely say that. It gives us the social lift for many people in the regions that wouldn't have it otherwise. It keeps people calm. We also don't want to have these people back at home trying to reintegrate into the society after being at war, and some of them are also criminals, right? That also creates a lot of challenges. I would probably advise to find ways to freeze the conflict, the war temporarily, to be able to invest and rearm more skillfully, and then think what kind of levers we have vis-a-vis Europe, if we can put more pressure on Europe. So that would be, unfortunately, my advice for if I were Grey Cardinal in Putin's administration.
Elina, Arkady, thank you so much indeed for your time. It's been fascinating talking to you both. That's the Forecast. Until next time, bye-bye.